the preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
I'd like to open the proceedings with a quote, if I may, and I'll just read it, and it'll give, I think, some context to our remarks. The quote is, "Few people would dispute the fact that the New York Times is the most important American newspaper. It serves the world public because it obviously serves it well. The editor and critic of art on this influential publication must have of necessity judicial, scholarly, aesthetically sensitive, imaginative, and executive capabilities. Perhaps more than any other writer on art in America, the Times critic does possess these versatile qualities. He has consistently preserved balance in his investigations of the past, in his unprejudiced consideration of the present, and in his search for the aesthetic of tomorrow." These words were written about Edward Alden Jewell in 1939, but in certain ways I think they apply as well today. Hilton Kramer is, I think, the art critic of the most record and certainly the most power in our own particular moment. Now, an art critic can't close down an exhibition in quite the same way a drama critic might close down a play. But someone like Mr. Kramer, and Mr. Kramer in a very particular way, has enormous power. He can be a person whose sensitivity opens up tremendous possibilities with a younger or an older artist who's being rediscovered, or he can be, as I think Hilton has been on certain occasions, a kind of exquisite executioner. How do you deal with the enormous power of your position, and what are its implications in your personal life?
Well, I suppose it will sound frivolous to say that I deal with the question of the power that accrues to the Times art critic by not paying any attention to it at all. But that really is closer to the truth than I think any other way of putting it. It simply isn't profitable, either intellectually, aesthetically, or emotionally, to worry about the sort of effect, the kind of power effect that critical judgments or critical elucidations are going to make. Once a critic feels that what he's saying is correct, that it's worth saying, that he's speaking honestly and disinterestedly, then he simply accepts the consequences of his discourse. I would also like to say, however, that I think the whole question of the power of criticism is one that is greatly misunderstood. That is, that there is really only one uncontested form of power that accrues to the art critic of the New York Times, and that is his power to nominate an artist or an event to a degree of visibility that the artist or the event would not otherwise have. That is, if you write about something in the Times, even unfavorably, and one might almost say particularly unfavorably, you nominate it for a kind of visibility, for a kind of publicity that it would not otherwise have. Beyond that, everything is uncertain. I know I've written highly favorable reviews of exhibitions in which not a single painting has been sold. That, frankly, is a matter of total indifference to me. I've also written favorable exhibitions, favorable reviews of exhibitions in which every painting has been sold. That also is a matter of indifference to me. I've written very unfavorable reviews of exhibitions in which every painting has been sold. That also is a matter of indifference to me, though I must say I do always feel a little bit more ironical about those occasions. But the question of influence acquires an almost superstitious or perhaps even a supernatural quality in the minds of certain parts of one's readership, particularly in the professional world, because people feel, well, of course, he isn't exercising any power over me, but look at all those other people he's influencing. It doesn't really work that way. The way reputations are established, the way works of art take their place in the life of culture is far too complex in a culture like ours to be manipulated by a single writer or a single publication. And in any case, it's really not a profitable subject for an artist to reflect on, and still less for a critic. Because once a critic begins to be overly concerned, or really concerned at all, with the exercise of power, then he becomes inhibited in making the kind of fluent judgment that his position requires. And he begins to engage in a kind of shadow play, a kind of social work, in which he has to gauge with each judgment and each review whether or not he's going to damage somebody's happiness. If you are tremendously sensitive to such matters, then I think you have no place in the world of criticism. I remember once, it was actually at the Whitney Museum, as Pat Sims and other people in the museum world know, I don't attend many museum functions, or indeed many art world functions. I don't find them terribly amusing, and my wife abhors them, thank God. So I don't go to many of them. But on this one particular occasion, it was a dinner for Saul Steinberg, and I'm a great admirer of Steinberg's, and as I had already written about him, I felt free to go to the dinner, you see. One of the people seated at our table was Woody Allen. And he was in a particularly phobic state that evening. And he asked to have his seat changed because from his original place at the table, he felt that people from the street could observe him and maybe assassinate him or something. And so he ended up seated next to me, and the very charming woman who was seated on my left was removed, and Woody Allen was plunked down in her place. And at some point, because he immediately asked me my opinion of every movie critic in town. And I had to confess that I really didn't go to the movies very much. And then he asked me if I was ever embarrassed when I encountered socially an artist that I had written about very unfavorably. And I thought this was a perfectly disinterested question. Didn't occur to me until later, going uptown in a taxi, what the origin of it was. And I said, no, I was never embarrassed. I thought the artist should be embarrassed. After all, it was the artist who put this inferior work before the public. All I did was identify its failures. So it's the artist who should really be embarrassed, not the critic. It wasn't until several hours later that I remembered that on one of the rare occasions when I wrote about films, I wrote something very unfavorable about Woody Allen in the front. But in any case, I certainly wasn't embarrassed that evening.
Well, now, as a critic, you have the option when you see something that you find offensive or difficult of choosing not to review it or to review it. If you found something to be very abhorrent, and we are living in a city where there are tremendous options and other alternatives, would your choice be to write about the objects or artists or exhibition that you found so abhorrent, or to move on to something that you might be more positive about?
Oh, I almost never write about the exhibitions that are really horrible, which I won't say they constitute most of the art that one sees, but they do loom large in one's weekly rounds. My own, I mean, everybody who writes about art for the Times has his own, sort of makes his own policy on these matters. There's no company line on it. My own, the only strict policy I enforce upon myself is that I never review works, particularly first solo exhibition an artist is having in New York, if I think it's a bad exhibition, because there doesn't seem to be any point in saying to the readers of the New York Times, here's an artist you've never heard of, and his show stinks. On the other hand, work that has acquired, through no fault of the New York Times, a status and visibility on the art scene, which one finds to be to fail more than it succeeds, seems to me a perfectly not only legitimate subject for the Times critic to write about, but a necessary one. And so I think probably you'll find that most of the unfavorable reviews tend to be written about pretty well established, or at least known quantities in the art world.
In 1959, you were writing about several books that had appeared, and you took the opportunity to write about criticism in a more general way, and you said that the elucidation of the work of art itself and the placing of it in a coherent context of experience and history is the function of critical writing. Has your sense of that function expanded, changed in the last few years?
No, I don't think it has really. I think the best statement about the function of criticism that anyone has made for modern times was the one that T.S. Eliot made when he said in his essay on the function of criticism that it's the function of criticism to explicate works of art and correct taste. Now, the correction of taste sounds terribly snobbish and so on, but we're all doing it all the time. It is virtually an involuntary function of any kind of aesthetic response. And if you're not really interested in taste, you're not interested in art. Indeed, you're not interested in life. I think that placing a work of art or an artist's entire work in the context, in its cultural environment, as it were, and its historical context, is a terribly important part of the critical function. I would say probably since I wrote those words in 1959, it's become a more important part of the critical function, because the readers of criticism, I would say in the last 20 years or so, aren't as well educated in matters of cultural history, or indeed history of any kind, today as they were 20 or 25 years ago. I mean, one has the sense, particularly reading the mail that comes to the New York Times, one has the sense of writing for a kind of amnesiac public, in which nothing that happened earlier than the day before yesterday is ever very vividly recalled, and even as we speak, yesterday is sort of receding into the historical mist, so that it becomes one of the necessities of a critic to remind his readers of the world from which this work of art emerged.
One thing that I think we can all detect beneath all of what you say is that you probably come from somewhere around Boston.
Yes, just 35 miles north on Cape Ann.
Now, I'd like to just look into your own history for a moment. and say, where did you kind of emerge as an art critic? Your education is extensive. You began working in the 50s for the later Arts Digest, which merged into Arts Magazine really a few months after you arrived there. You'd done some teaching before that, I believe. How did you decide that criticism was the orientation which you wished to take?
Well, I suppose like most of the major things that happened to one in life, it was a kind of accident. I had always been intensely interested in art, visual art, since my childhood, having grown up in Gloucester, which when I was a kid was still a very lively summer art colony. Stuart Davis and Hopper and lots of well-known American painters painted there. In fact, Grace Borgenecht is just about to put on an exhibition of paintings from Gloucester. Milton Avery painted there. Hans Hofmann had his first school there. Of course, I knew none of those people. And as in most summer art colonies, most of the paintings that were done there every summer were very bad paintings. But nonetheless, bad painting at a certain time in one's life can be as inspiring as a good painting. And like most of the kids that I grew up with, we all painted when we were young. And I actually probably was about the last generation that could still enroll in a WPA drawing class, which was in 1939, I think, when I was 11 years old. And art was, just sort of part of one's environment. It wasn't anything remarkable to the people in the town. It was much less remarkable than the sort of millionaires who came every summer to stay in their big houses. And I was quite intensely involved in that until I went to high school, when my interests sort of shifted somewhat toward literature, but I continued to paint. And I continued to paint and draw a good deal, right up until the time I stumbled by accident one day into the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Now, those are very different times. I went to a very good school. I had very good teachers in English, Latin, history, and all the classical subjects. I never had a teacher in high school who ever mentioned that there was a Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, 35 miles away. And we used to go to the Symphony on Friday afternoons. And I was bored at the Symphony one day and walked out and was wandering around Huntington Avenue and found this museum, which nobody had ever told me about. And wandered in, and I can safely say now that I suppose my life was never the same again. Now, museums, at least the Boston Museum in those days, because this was the Second World War, but I don't think the war had all that much to do with it. There was nobody there. Quite literally, you could spend an entire afternoon in the museum and not see another person, not even a guard, because people didn't even steal things in those days. And it, of course, was wonderful. Particularly if you didn't know anything, and so you really didn't know what you were looking at, and you could come to everything in that kind of innocent way. When I went to Syracuse as an undergraduate, my interests were primarily in literature and philosophy. I enrolled for about 15 minutes in an art history course, but I really couldn't get interested in memorizing slides of a lot of paintings I'd never seen. I was much more interested in finding out about the paintings I had seen. And those weren't of interest to the people who were teaching, so I decided my interests were elsewhere. But my interests in the visual arts, nonetheless, were continued to be quite intense. And as it turned out, most of my friends in my student days were either art students or art teachers. And when I was an undergraduate, I was actually involved in helping to organize a gallery. You see, these were prehistoric times. And in the art school at Syracuse University in those days, for reasons of morality, the painting students were not allowed to paint in their studios after 9 o'clock in the evening. 9 o'clock seemed to be the hour at which morals were expected to deteriorate. And so we supported our gallery by renting 2 floors of a building and renting out studio space to art students on 1 floor where they could paint all night, and then out of that rental money we ran the gallery. Anyway, it was a terrible gallery and the art was awful and so on, but it was, as I now realize, but it was very exciting. And when I came to New York to a graduate school at Columbia, which was in January of 1950, it was a very good moment, let us say, to be making one's first entry into the 57th Street galleries. And while I was ostensibly in New York to go to graduate school at Columbia, I ended up spending much more time going to galleries and museums and going to lectures at the new school and actually at Columbia. I never took a degree because my interests were all drifting into other directions. I still never it occurred to me that that I would either write art criticism or have anything have that kind of interest, that kind of connection with the art world. I was much more interested in literary criticism in those days and began to write some, and became involved in the literary world. And it wasn't until a painter friend of mine, who was then studying at the Art Students League, and I were talking about some exhibitions we had seen one day in 1952, that he suggested that I write something. And as I was unemployed and had nothing better to do, I did. And I sent it to an editor I knew at Patterson Review, and it was published. And I suddenly woke up one day, a few months later, and found that I was an art critic, because once this piece appeared in Patterson Review, everybody was calling me up and saying, well, won't you write for us? And anyway, that's how it all happened.
But clearly, in your work for magazines, you could have a different kind of responsibility than you do at the Times. You could write longer pieces, and you could also write less frequently. You worked through the early 60s at Arts Magazine and then subsequently doing other kinds of related work. What caused you to want to go to the Times at the moment that you did?
Well, I'd never thought anything about going to the Times. I'd always considered myself a magazine writer, insofar as I thought about such things at all. And even though I've been at the Times for 16 years, I still think of myself more as a magazine writer than as a newspaper man. The great problem in writing for newspapers about serious subjects is space. You have to compress a great deal of thought into relatively few words. And if you think of the kind of essays or salon reviews that were written by Diderot or Baudelaire, Félix Fénéon, Zola, and so on throughout the 19th century, or even the essays that Roger Fry used to write in the Burlington magazine. Even a long review in the New York Times is a very short-breathed discourse, and that's perhaps the single most difficult part of it. However, one tries to be serious in a short discourse, as serious as in a long one. You have to be you have to resign yourself to there being a great deal that's going to be left unsaid. On the other hand, when I pick up the art journals nowadays, I find myself very impatient with some of the lengthier discourses because I feel, maybe it's my practice journalist's eye now, I feel that if I took a blue pencil to these manuscripts, I could really get them, I could reduce them to both a shorter and more readable length without too much trouble. But that might have something to do with what's happened to criticism now. Ideally, one should write about serious subjects at a much greater length than one can in a newspaper.
You've written at some length about the artist Milton Avery, Brancusi, his photographs, Lachaise, and Lindner. Do you miss the opportunity to take that kind of very partisan approach to artists? Or do you feel that it's satisfied by your shorter pieces?
Oh, I certainly would welcome the opportunity or the time to write about certain artists at much greater length than I've so far had the time to do. And who knows, one of these days I may get to do more of that.
Does the opportunity to write at least twice a week in the Times, hold such magnetism for you that you don't drift off, as it were, to write longer articles? Is the job so compelling that you wish to keep it for as long as you can?
Well, it is certainly a very interesting job that is not likely abandoned. However, I'm not one of those people on West 43rd Street who feels that the New York Times is the only game in town. And the time may very well come when I'll want to do something else. After all, when I was first offered my job at the Times, my wife, who had had some experience of the art world before we were married, and we were only just married, and she happened to be out when the day I got this strange telephone call asking me if I'd be interested in coming to the New York Times. And when she came back and I told her I'd gotten this call, and she said, "Well, you're not considering it, are you?" Because, of course, in the art world, the New York Times art page had always been public enemy number one, with, I hasten to add, ample reason. And in any case, it seemed like something one would do for a year or two or three, and it's still something of a shock to us.
How have you changed the character of the page, or how would you like to think you've changed the character of the page?
Well, I think if nothing else, we've managed to remove a certain element of, say, paranoia that separated the New York art world from the New York Times art pages.
So you think there's a greater liaison between the art world and the art page at this point than there has been before?
Well, I think there's sort of a greater understanding. Maybe sympathy isn't the right word, but well, quite frankly, I think the art page is much more intelligent now than it was in the past. And we've worked very hard to make it more intelligent. And it isn't, love that's needed, it's just intelligence.
How do you gauge your success in terms of reaching out to the art world? And how would one decide whether, in fact, one was in some way bridging a gap that you might have felt was on the page previous to your tenure?
Well, there are no, I think, objective measures. Partly one is able to judge because the people who were shaking fists at the New York Times 20 years ago aren't shaking them quite as frequently.
It's probably
now.
New fists, though.
Well, they're new fists, yes, and life would be intolerable in my position if there weren't the requisite number of fists still being shaken. But nonetheless, I mean, one has a sense that even one's worst enemies, read the page with a certain interest. And of course, there is no such thing as a New York Times position on any odd event. When I took over the primary responsibility at the end of '73, we went to a great deal of trouble at my suggestion to bring John Russell over from London, because we wanted a good writer, and John is a very good writer, and we wanted somebody who was very knowledgeable, which he certainly is. And I particularly wanted somebody who could be counted upon to have tastes and a point of view that were quite different from my own, so that there would be no question of there being some sort of monolithic New York Times view of what was going on in the art scene. And I think that's worked out pretty well, not to everybody's satisfaction. But
Shifting to some of the mechanics of your job, how many announcements for exhibitions would you receive in a week?
Well, I've never had the heart to count them. When I first came to the paper, there was a secretary who made out a 3x5 card for every announcement that came in, and we had these great files, and every time I opened that file, my heart would sink. But even then, we didn't count them. I don't know how many there are.
How many do you try to attend in a week? How many exhibitions do you try to visit?
Well, I generally average between about 15 and 20 a week.
How do you decide what exhibitions you'll see?
Well, it's an improvisation, frankly. First of all, there are the news interests of the newspaper that have to be served, so that if there is a new wing opening at the Metropolitan Museum or a major exhibition at the Whitney, then that is certainly going to be on the agenda for that week. Whether it's dealt with on Friday, Sunday, or some other way is also a matter of negotiation between different editors on the paper and amongst members of the staff. Beyond those sort of big museum events, which are guaranteed coverage out of the news interest, then there are the exhibitions by well-established major figures. And we certainly try to keep up with their work. If de Kooning is having an exhibition, one of the other of us is certainly going to write about it, and because we'll all go to see it. We all try to see as many exhibitions by new artists as possible. We don't write about them all. And of course, we don't ever write about all the exhibitions we see, because it would be impossible. There's not enough space in the paper, and there's not enough time.
Do you
in one's
make
life.
a conscious effort in terms of the 15 galleries or museum exhibitions that you might see to see that if John or Grace would go to other exhibitions? Do you try to cover what's going on?
Yes, we try to cover both geographically and aesthetically as much of the territory as possible. Who reviews what is, there's no system. It's an improvisation. In principle, I have first choice of exhibitions. I know there are some things that John Russell is more interested in than I am, or Grace Glick is more interested in, or Vivian Rayner, and there are some things I'm happy to avoid. There are other exhibitions I know John would be eager to avoid. We try to accommodate each other. We try to do justice to both the scene and to ourselves.
Once you go to one of those exhibitions which don't fall into the categories you just described, and you really enjoy it and feel you want to review it, could you just describe in some maybe perhaps semi-poetic way what it is that you respond to in a very general way? How you know this is going to be an exhibition that you feel you want to review?
Well, I suppose the most important thing is the sensation of pleasure that it gives you. If you're seeing an artist's work for the first time and it doesn't give you a sensation of pleasure or an interest that is more intense than you might, doesn't elicit a response that's more intense than you might feel elsewhere, then it'd be pretty hard to work up the intellectual energy to write about it. On the other hand, that's not always a reliable guide to the art experience. I've had, and I'm sure many people have had, the experience of walking into an exhibition and feeling nothing but recoil, and then finding, say, a few days later, that that exhibition has stayed with you in a way that the exhibitions that you found most pleasurable, more pleasurable that day, have not. And so the only thing to do is to go back and look at it again and see what it was that affected you in this way, even though you didn't particularly like it. And in the end, liking it, not liking it is not necessarily the key issue, I think, in criticism anyway. What the critic is trying to do is to isolate some core of the experience that the work is giving you. And while it's inevitable that you pass judgment on it, because that's what we all do with everything in life, whether it's art objects or people or dinner, that is not necessarily the most important thing about a review or criticism, or indeed about the art experience. It's much more that sort of inner communication between yourself and the object that counts, rather than saying yes, no, good, bad, I like it, I didn't like it, and so on.
The New York Times is, of course, a New York paper, but it's also a paper with a world audience. How much opportunity do you have to travel, and how much of that opportunity is subsidized by the Times?
Well, we travel a lot, certainly a great deal in this country. It's all subsidized by the Times. The Times has a very strict rule against any members of its staff accepting any kind of gratuities or paid travel, anything of that sort, strictly forbidden. On, I think, the very sound assumption that if, say, a museum in Timbuktu sends you a ticket and provides you with luxurious hotel accommodations to come and see their exhibition, you would be likely to be disinclined to write unfavorably about it, particularly if you wanted a return engagement. We travel a lot. The Times isn't quite as open-handed as they were when I first came because of changing economic conditions. But I go to Europe quite often. The first years I worked for the paper, I went to Western Europe every year. I went to the Soviet Union, Sao Paulo for the Biennale. We were in California 2 or 3 times a year. And we still get around quite a lot.
I always wonder why arts coverage doesn't make the front page of the Arts and Leisure section all that frequently. This is a section that we all know, and it is supposed to give a kind of general embrace of the arts, but very seldom does art make the front page.
Well, you see, this is a matter of generational perspective, because when I first came to the Times, the Sunday, what is now the Arts and Leisure section, had been known for as long as anybody could remember as the Sunday theater section. and the only things that were written about on the front page of that section were the theater and movies. Music never, visual arts never, ballet never. Television didn't exist, as it were. And I think it was in the late 60s, or probably the opening of Lincoln Center may have made a dent in the minds of certain editors. And we gradually were able to persuade them that there really were art events that were as important as last week's lousy Broadway opening. And so, from our point of view, we've made tremendous progress, although I grant you that the subjects on our page are usually of much more cultural and artistic significance than many of the things that appear on the front page of the Times Sunday section. But, of course, I say that as somebody who wouldn't be caught dead at any of those Broadway plays that people love so much. I mean, I think they're terrible. I don't know why people waste their time going to them. I mean, the actors don't know how to act, and the playwrights don't know how to write, and it's
Well, this
a
may be
hopeless
the
enterprise.
subject of another week, but
Anyway, I agree with you in principle.
your writing often takes a very sociological approach, and you deal with general cultural issues, and you often eschew or avoid talking about individual works of art and the experience of an individual work of art. Do you think that's, you obviously think that's the appropriate approach to take, but do you think in a way you might garner a larger audience for the works of art if you could deal with them in a more individual way?
Well, partly the problem of being able to deal with individual objects is goes back to the question of the length of the articles that you're writing. An entire article that was devoted to a single object in a newspaper would, well, it might be interesting as an occasional experiment, but as a day in, day out, week in, week out form of critical discourse, I think it would result in the prompt loss of a great deal of your readership. And so in dealing with more general aspects of the art experience, one is trying to do two things. One, address the audience that has seen those objects or is likely to see those objects and perhaps is not in a position to bring to them some of the background that I feel is necessary to an understanding of them. And also, frankly, I go into a lot of these sort of contextual matters of cultural history because I don't see anybody else doing it. And I think it's a very important constituent in the understanding of the art that you're seeing. If you go to the Kandinsky show at the Guggenheim, for example, and you read in the catalog something about that's being said about Kandinsky's relation to the middle class in Munich before 1914, it turns out to be absolute rubbish, as in this case it is, then it's important to say in your article that what is being said about Kandinsky's relation to the middle class in Munich before 1914 is rubbish. And so, you know, that's that's a service function.
You write many of your articles, I think, with the presumption that very few people who will read them will actually experience what you've experienced, which may, of course, explain in some sense why you would take a more generalized point of view towards your material. But moving on to some other questions just about your approach, what responsibility do you feel when you change your mind about an artist, either in a sense that becomes positive or negative?
Well, I don't know that I do feel any particular responsibility. I mean, there's the responsibility to be honest, but very often the only people who really remember what my position was that I may have now changed, myself and the artist. So that to make sort of heavy weather over that would just, be to occupy too much one's energy. I don't think it necessarily. I haven't found that it looms as a big issue for me.
Do you collect art?
No, I don't. I sometimes buy things. I've never sold anything. And I have pictures. I'm not going to tell you what they are.
Let us say there was an artist about whom you'd written very favorably, and he or she wished to give you a work of art. What would your position be?
Well, my position before 1965 would have been to say thank you very much. My position since 1965 has been to say I'm terribly sorry, but it's against the rules.
What proportion, or do you have any sense of a proportion, of historical and contemporary exhibitions do you like to review?
I'm sorry.
What proportion of contemporary and historical exhibitions do you like to review? Or do you have any sense of making some proportion of such exhibitions?
No, I don't really. I mean, it seems to normally be the case that I mostly write about works of art that are created in our own time, except on the occasions of these big museum exhibitions. I would guess that probably since I've been at the Times, at least 3/4 of what I've written has been about the work of either living artists or recently deceased artists.
What responsibility do you feel to encouraging younger talent?
None.
Do you feel that that is the responsibility of some critics and not your responsibility?
Well, I suppose it is. You see, I think it's the responsibility of critics, whether they write in the Times or wherever they write, to tell the truth as they see it. And the truth isn't always encouraging to young artists or to old artists either, for that matter. I think now, particularly since we live in a culture in which there are so many inducements to pursue an artistic career, that it really isn't necessarily, doesn't necessarily become one of the responsibilities of a critic to sort of add his voice to the chorus of cheerleaders. I mean, there are already, we already have more artists than we can accommodate, and we're going to have more and more. I mean, you can't keep them down. It's been estimated that there are more professional artists at work today in this country, and by that I mean people who actually, show their work, than existed in Italy during the entire Renaissance.
You don't find that an encouraging statistic?
I don't find it either encouraging or discouraging. I find it phenomenal. It certainly contradicts the whole notion of our living in a kind of Philistine society and so on. I mean, we're becoming a nation of aesthetes.
But you won't change the title of your next book.
No.
There are spaces like PS1 and the New Museum and Artist Space, which take a very encouraging attitude toward younger art. Are these places that you try to attend with any frequency?
Well, I go there from time to time. I certainly don't see every exhibition. I see more exhibitions at the New Museum than at PS1 because, for a very simple practical reason. On the day that I go to see PS1, it takes so long to get there and so long to come back, and it takes so long to sort of walk down those gloomy halls, that I have to give up the opportunity to see about 10 or 15 exhibitions in Manhattan. And so I have to weigh, I have to make a decision. Am I likely to, is it likely that what I see at PS1 is going to be worth missing 15 exhibitions on 57th Street or Soho?
Your book, your 1972 book, was called The Age of the Avant-Garde, and its central premise was effectively that the age of the avant-garde was over, that that kind of a period no longer existed in kind of world cultural life. Do you think that that's still true? And if you do you think in a certain way, by not perhaps espousing as great enthusiasm as you might for contemporary art, you've contributed to that circumstance?
Well, I don't think I've contributed to the circumstance. I think I've contributed to the recognition of the circumstance. No, I think that the period of the existence of an effective avant-garde really was drawing to a close right around the time I was arriving on the scene. The abstract expressionists were really the last of what I call the unpopular art movements. Now, since then, we've had art movements that are eminently dislikable, but they're not unpopular. They're not resisted in the way that the traditional avant-garde was. They couldn't be, because the whole ethos of the avant-garde has been institutionalized. I mean, by your institution, by the Museum of Modern Art, by the New York Times, by virtually all the centers of cultural power in the country. There are now sort of great cadres of curators, critics, collectors who are on the alert 24 hours a day, waiting for any new thing to reveal itself. And as soon as that new thing reveals itself, they pounce on it, and they show it, and they buy it, and they advertise it and promote it. And you can't have an avant-garde under those conditions. I mean, it's impossible.
But you've taken a kind of an Olympian view to those kinds of developments, because they strike you as very superficial.
Well, I think where any evidence of novelty is so quickly grasped, promoted, inflated, and marketed, and sent on its merry way, to the tax accountants, that ideas tend to be shorter lived and used up more quickly. I don't know that my attitude is Olympian. I think I'm just observing, the progress of certain cultural development. I don't feel particularly Olympian. I feel very much involved. I frankly wish that it might be otherwise. But this is what it is.
What critics do you yourself read? What criticism interests you and engages you in your own field and in other fields?
Well, out of the, at the present time, except for the work of my own colleagues, I cannot honestly say that there are many critics writing about art that interest me very much. I suppose the critic of our time in New York that I myself have learned the most from, though I tend to disagree with him more than not, is Clement Greenberg. But Clement Greenberg really doesn't write criticism anymore. And when he was writing it, he was writing, I think, the best criticism we had. But now there's a man who's become Olympian, and he's so Olympian that he doesn't really write criticism anymore. He simply hands down pronouncements. And maybe, maybe that's the terrible fate in store for all of us. But certainly, I think Greenberg has been certainly the leading critic of his generation. And for me, he's one of a sort of triad of critics who have influenced my thinking a great deal. Roger Fry being another, and the German critic Meyergraffer being the third, Julius Meyergraffer. And but I'm very much influenced by critics in the past, particularly the criticism of Henry James, for example, has been probably as central a body of writing in shaping my thought about what the important questions of criticism are and the proper way to go about dealing with them.
I just have one more rather general question to ask you, and it deals with so much of the attitude that I think that underlies a good deal of your writing. What do you think about the climate of American culture, and do you think it's conducive to the growth of artists in this country?
Well, I certainly think that the climate, the cultural climate of our society is conducive to the production of art. What I sometimes worry a great deal about is whether it's conducive to the production of seriousness. We don't have to really question, I think, whether or not our society encourages the production of art, because as I've just observed, I mean, we're drowning in it. And the fact that more and more people want to produce art, want to look at it, more and more people want to buy it, they want to talk about it, they'll come out on cold nights to hear a critic speak about it. That question is no longer a question. I mean, we know the answer to that. Whether there's something in the dynamics of our culture that, on the one hand, produces this huge sort of unappeased appetite for aesthetic experience on the one hand, and yet discourages a certain kind of intellectual and even moral seriousness about it on the other, is the question that often concerns me. And I think one of the reasons why I think it is an issue of concern, and not just a kind of private interest of my own, is that I find that more and more artists feel this way. And the one thing which is also part of the same issue, the one thing that I find particularly the younger generation of artists, the younger generations of artists, miss more than anything else, is the sense of living in a culture in which there are real masters, in which there are figures that can really be looked up to as masters, not necessarily because there's a yearning to imitate them or emulate them, maybe just the contrary. Maybe there's a yearning to have a master that one can recoil against, that one can react against. Everything tends in our culture to be sort of too mushy. And this sense that one has had now for some years that there's a great deal going on, a great deal of quality and interest, but a kind of missing core of mastery. That's not an invention of mine. That's not a figment of my imagination. It's something that I feel, that artists feel about their own situation. And what it may signify is a kind of separation that's occurred in our aesthetic experience between aesthetic gratification on the one hand, a certain kind of moral seriousness about art on the other.
Thank you. Are there questions from those of you?
The emergence of the kind of mastery that I think we're talking about.
You had a question?
Yes, you mentioned that when you went to Columbia, you never did graduate and you were sort of moving around in different directions. And I was wondering how and where you managed, because obviously you did, to get a substantive education in art and in the history that it attends it and all of that.
The question is where since I didn't legally, as it were, study art history, where did I pick up what I know? Is that the question? Well, the short answer to that question is in the museums. That is, it's been primarily a project in self-education. There was a period of about 2 years when, in my freelancing days, and when I had no other responsibilities in my life except to look after myself, when I went to the Metropolitan Museum for an hour or two, every day it was open. And I didn't go to do research in anything I was writing about at the time. I just went to look. And I've often thought that maybe at least part of my feeling about Mr. Hoving's regime at the Metropolitan Museum stemmed from the fact that this period of my life was pre-Hoving, and in those pre-Hoving days, at the end of 2 years, I pretty much knew where every single object in the Metropolitan was. And then he came along and not only moved them all around, but actually sold quite a few good ones. But that's really the only way you educate yourself in art, is to go and look at it. And about the things that you look at that really interest you, then you want to read as much about them as you can lay hands on.
Are there other questions? Yes.
When you speak of the absence of masters, are you saying that in effect that there is a decline in quality? And if there's a decline in quality, is there a decline in taste, as many social critics are saying is on?
I guess the question is if does this absence of masters suggest that there is a decline in quality and decline in taste?
Well, if there's a decline in quality, does that mean there is also a decline in taste? And many social critics believe that there is an overall decline in aesthetic taste.
Yes. Well, I am not myself of the view that there is a decline in taste in our society. Quite the opposite. I remember Barbara Tuchman wrote that piece in Times Magazine a few years ago, which I frankly found perfectly absurd. If you, and she's old enough to know better. If you remember the kind of narrowness of taste, a couple of 2 or 3 decades ago, when, say, the audience for an abstract painting was minuscule, or for something like the New York City Ballet. It was a period of my life in the 50s when I went to New York City Ballet 3-4 times a week when they were on 55th Street. And you saw the same faces there every night. I don't mean on the stage, I mean in the audience. And there are still people I run into in New York on the street. I've never known their names, and they don't know my name, but we nod to each other because we saw each other every night for 10 years at the New York City Ballet. Well, that's not true anymore. I mean, and it's not just fashion. There's been an increase in the level of taste and response to great art, to great artistic experiences in our society, to a level that's much, I mean, it's a phenomenon of much greater scope than certainly existed in my childhood and youth. That is, and to that extent, standards are higher now than they were in the past. That's one reason why I think serious people don't go to the theater. Their standards are too high. Great art doesn't necessarily come out of that situation. It may even be that the kind of cultural situation we have in this country now, it may be inimical to the creation of the kind of mastery we're talking about. We don't know, because we've never, neither in our own society nor at any time in the historical past that we know about, have we ever been in quite this situation in which an entire society seemed to be going absolutely mad about aesthetic matters, wanting more and more and more of them. It's something that we always said would, was what we wanted, and what we were all sort of working to encourage. But it may be that we'll discover that this is not what creates the greatest art. Now, I'm not saying that that is the case. We don't know. It may be that maybe you need to have a more fanatical, more sectarian impulse dictating artistic inspiration than we have in our culture today to produce the kind of masters we once had. We don't know that either. But the one thing we do know about this sort of marvelous, pluralistic, voluminous aesthetic culture at the moment, the one thing we do know about it, based on recent experiences, that it doesn't seem fertile in producing the kinds of really big figures that these more benighted situations in earlier times seem to produce fairly prolifically.
If I might interject just for 1 second. Hilton, when you talk about such big figures, is there anybody who comes to your own mind in this time?
Of who qualify as the big
Who
figures?
qualifies at the levels that you're speaking of?
Well, if you say assume that Picasso and Matisse set a certain level of mastery in the 20th century, to go no further than that, then I myself find it hard to find a living figure who is in the same class.
If you did find such a figure, what would you do about him or her?
Applaud. I'm not sure. I suppose it would depend on what age the artist was. If the artists were young, I would try to keep it a secret, particularly from the artist.
Yes.
I think it is significant that we seem to be talking mainly from the point of view of the spectator, and the artist himself is the questionable element that you seem to leave out. That's the thing that causes a word, saying we have a spectator world, that we do not have the artist rise to the level to which we want to. The spectators, do they really create the artist? The artist's job himself is to
Oh,
make the art.
yes. No, well, certainly the spectator does not create the artist.
The way you were describing it seems to remain the spectator's element. In other words, it was very clear that the artist themselves seem to be like the element.
Well, I think in every culture, the artistic figures spring from a certain cultural soil, as it were, and
In other words, you're talking about a reciprocal process.
I think so. Yes, there is a. I mean, the artist exists in relation to his culture.
Let me ask that question again and say, who do you think is lacking in the context the way you mentioned it? It seems to be putting the blame on the spectator, but it's not on the artist as well. I mean, that's the general question.
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite get. No, no, I'm sorry.
You seem to be speaking from the point of view of the audience. And I know
Well, let me just say the question. The remark is that I seem to be speaking from the point of view of the audience. Well, a critic is part of the audience. I mean, a critic is not an artist, and though certain critics have sometimes been confused about that. And I'm not speaking for the artist. I mean, that would be highly presumptuous. I'm speaking as a, I am speaking as a spectator, as you suggest.
you seem bewildered by the lack of artists in our time.
I don't feel bewildered at all. No, I don't feel the least bit bewildered.
Let's take two more questions. Yes, sir.
How have your own tastes changed since you started writing?
How have my own tastes changed? Well, I suppose that the biggest change for me has come in an appreciation of certain parts, certain aspects of the art of the past that didn't interest me as much when I was younger as they interest me now. A painter like David, for example, was somebody I simply couldn't look at 20 years ago. And now I'm stunned to see how unresponsive I was to such a great artist. Maybe not still one of the greatest, but an artist of tremendous power. Regarding the art of my own time, I suppose I've, to some degree, less enthusiastic about certain kinds of figurative painting than I used to be, and more responsive to certain modes of abstract art than I used to be, although it's a matter of degree. And of course, what has also changed is not just me, but the art that has been produced in the course of those years. And it's really, it's not only one's mind that changes. What changes one's mind is the art one sees. And the greater the depth of experience, the more one sees in works of art that one might have been quite blind to at an earlier time in one's life.
Yes.
You were saying there were no masters that you describe now. Well, what does an artist have to have done, or what does the
Well, I don't, with all due respect to the question is a perfectly good one. I mean, yes,
Because you just said that thing about David.
yeah.
And what if you were writing about David today? He's sitting there, and you're saying there are no great, artists, and then, your successor at the Times, says you missed that.
Well, what would my situation be? It would be the situation of a great many of my predecessors in this profession. I will have been proved wrong. And well, this is a curious thing to say because it will sound so awful. But I don't have any criteria. That is, I don't go out with to exhibitions with a list of obligations that the artist or his work must meet. I don't. I mean, I think you tend more to do that when you're young. That is, you go out looking for certain things and you experience a certain sense of disappointment if you don't find them, which you mostly don't. Or if you think you find them, you feel certain gratification. But you're looking for something. You have a mission, and you're looking for an object to satisfy that mission. I don't think that really is the way art is experienced. That is, I don't think you can say, well, I mean, I could get up a list of 10 criteria and say, well, it would have to be this, and this. But then a real artist is going to violate all those and still be a great artist and still be a great artist anyway. You can't. I mean, after all, Diderot, who virtually began my profession, denounced Boucher. He thought Boucher was morally harmful. Now, that makes us smile because it makes us laugh. Diderot seems like such a perfect fool because of what he said about Boucher. But it was exactly what the followers of David and Ingres said about Delacroix. They thought he was just too soft and he had no taste. He had no sense of form, that what he represented was decadence. Well, I mean, do we laugh at that? I mean, you see, it's the same kind of stricture that Diderot was applying to Boucher. But when it comes out of an artist's mouth about another artist, it's acceptable to us. We don't consider it a mistake because we feel we can learn something from it. Well, there's actually quite a lot to be learned from Diderot's attack on Boucher. And actually, when you've finished reading Diderot's attack on Boucher, you see Boucher much more clearly than you did before. It's like Ruskin's attacks on the railroad stations in 19th century England. John Ruskin, the great English Victorian critic, wrote scathingly about the building of the British railway stations because he felt they represented a corruption of the English countryside, and it was a corruption of architectural taste. It was a monstrous blight on the very soul of England. But now architectural historians treasure Ruskin's accounts of those railway stations because nobody else took them seriously enough to write about them in such detail and with such passion and with such an eye. Because even though Ruskin didn't like them, he saw them in a way that nobody else had seen them before, and very few people have seen them since. So that it isn't necessarily the criteria it isn't the criteria that are going to tell you. It's the whole transaction that takes place between the critic, who's the observer, who's writing a certain kind of discourse, and the object about which he's writing. It's in that transaction, which is partly literary, partly aesthetic, partly spiritual, partly psychological. It's in that transaction that you either get something from a critic or you don't. And if you don't get it, then you shouldn't read it because life is too short.
There are many other questions, and I apologize to everyone. I think you might be able to come up and talk to Hilton privately about these matters. I would just say that clearly, as a formulator of opinions, as someone who clearly delights in taking positions, you are aptly suited to your line of work. Can you think of some alternative which would be as satisfactory to you?
An alternative profession?
Yes. Or a mode of living?
Well, I started out in life always expecting to be a professor somewhere, but I was, after being what in my generation was called a graduate school bum for a long time, and never having taken any of the degrees I was supposed to take, I suppose I've always sort of still harbored the wish that someday I might end up there. I don't know. I like the life that I have now, and I suppose I'll always want to be involved in some kind of writing, whether it remains this particular kind or not. Who's to say?
Well, you clearly can lecture to a very large classroom, as it were, in your position, and I want to just thank you for sharing so many of your thoughts with the group tonight. But please, I speak for Hilton, which is somewhat unfair, but if some of you do have additional questions after a couple of sips of water, I'm sure he would be clear to, he would clearly like to answer them for you. Thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you very much, Hilton.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.